Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it is the first of two episodes in which we're going to try and make some sense of what is going on at the moment in British politics, how we got to this state of affairs and how we might get out of them, but also trying to give a bit of historical perspective. You're going to hear a series of conversations with 5 experts recorded over the past few days, in which we are going to try and uncover the long, the medium, and the short-term causes of the current crisis. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that we don't chase the news on this podcast. We are not one of those podcasts. I did have a podcast of that kind a while ago that chased the news, particularly during the Brexit years, and I can tell you, it's exhausting. But the current state of British politics is so interesting and in many ways so unusual. It does seem to fit the remit of this podcast, which is to try and connect the past, the present, and the future. And there is a puzzle here, how we got to this point. And there is a big question, how we're going to get out of it. In this set of conversations, we've divided it up into 2 episodes, the first today, the next in our regular slot next time. Today, it's more about the causes of the crisis. Next time, it will be more about what might come next. You're going to hear in this episode from 5 people. First of all, PPF regular, historian Robert Saunders. Then the historian Anthony Seldon, who has written a series of books about all of the recent occupants of number 10 Downing Street. I'm sure he is planning one on Keir Starmer as we speak. And he's also written a book about the office of Prime Minister itself. He'll be followed by David Klemperer, another PPF regular. He was our guide to the politics of changing your mind. Then it's Hannah White, director of the Institute for Government. And finally, Rob Ford, political scientist and psephologist. Each of them is going to be answering questions about the causes of the crisis. And we start with Robert Saunders. Robert, how much of the instability in British politics at the moment do you think can be put down to process, in the sense that one of the things that has changed is the way in which prime ministers are chosen, party leaders are chosen, and therefore by extension prime ministers, and also the way in which prime ministers can be challenged. Many people have noticed that we seem to be getting through prime ministers faster than we used to. Is this a function of that, do you think?
I think there are a lot of different things going on, but yes, I do think process is part of the problem. It is completely normal in a parliamentary system to change prime minister between general elections. More than half of all prime ministers since 1945 have taken office between general elections. So it really matters how well we do this process. We used to do it quite quickly and efficiently. When Harold Wilson resigns in 1976, there is a new prime minister in place within 20 days. When Michael Heseltine challenges Margaret Thatcher in 1990, John Major arrives in number 10 exactly 14 days later. That has got very much more difficult because of the expansion of the franchise for who chooses leaders. The Labour Party, I think, has a particular problem right now, which is that it doesn't have a no-confidence procedure. It doesn't have a mechanism, which the Conservative Party does, by which MPs can essentially vote a Prime Minister out. What they have instead is a system that nobody believes actually works, by which a challenger who can win the support of a fifth of MPs can go forward to a contest against the Prime Minister among the party membership in the country. Nobody actually thinks that that is viable. Nobody thinks a Prime Minister can take 6 weeks off to fight a leadership contest in the country. No one really thinks it's democratically legitimate for party members to decide whether a Prime Minister stays or falls. So MPs and ministers have to try to work around this. They have to try to pressure a Prime Minister to leave office through things like chains of resignations. And that's made the whole process much more fraught, much more panic-ridden, and much more difficult to predict.
The Labour Party has history here in that this was attempted against Jeremy Corbyn. It didn't work in that case. But of course, Corbyn was not Prime Minister. he was leader of the opposition, and a leader of the opposition can take time out. In fact, it felt at the time that Jeremy Corbyn rather relished taking time out from his day job, as it were, to go back to the members. Also, he was very confident he retained the support of the members. So in this case, there are all sorts of instabilities at work. And yet, as you say, other things are going on. There's a pattern here. Conservative prime ministers found themselves in a similar predicament to Keir Starmer. The difference this time, Keir Starmer came into office with a very large majority, and the loss of authority has been precipitate. So far, so fast. And it feels like that can't just be put down to process.
No, absolutely. I think in some ways it's a little bit like arriving at the scene of a kind of disaster movie in which the houses have all burnt down, there are cars on fire, there's sewage running through the streets. And the question is it an earthquake? Is it about a sudden release of tension that's been building up over a very long period of time? Is it a meteor strike, which has just come out of the blue? Or is it about a sort of gradual process of neglect and decay? In other words, is it about the long term or the short term or the medium term? And we can absolutely tell a story here that starts in 2024, which is about the mistakes that Labour's made in office, is about the deficiencies of Keir Starmer as a leader, and the particular challenges that politics has faced in that period. We can also tell a long-term story, which is about the decay of the party system over the last half century, actually, in which a two-party system forged in the Second World War has been gradually eroding and is now reaching a kind of collapse state. Or we can tell a story which is actually really concentrated in the last kind of 10 to 15 years, in which we say actually all three of what have been the dominant political parties of the last 30 years or so have experienced some kind of crisis or catastrophe. The Liberal Democrats were almost annihilated in the general election of 2015. The Conservative Party went through 5 prime ministers in 6 years and suffered, by some measures, the largest defeat it's ever had in 2024. The Labour Party lost 4 general elections in a row and is now disintegrating inside office. And the fact that it's afflicted all 3 parties and prime ministers of such different political complexions suggests there is something going on here, which isn't just about the strengths and weaknesses of individual party leaders.
In that medium-term story, the relatively rapid turnover of prime ministers has happened since Brexit. It effectively started with David Cameron's resignation. Is Brexit symptom here, or is Brexit potentially cause? If you give that medium-term account, would you place Brexit in it as causal or symptomatic?
I would say that Brexit is a kind of explosion point, that the referendum itself happens partly because of a crisis in the Conservative Party, in which David Cameron is struggling to control forces on his own backbenches and is struggling to deal with a challenger party on the right. It's also actually, in some ways, about a crisis in British democracy. It's about a loss of trust in conventional party politics. It's about a sense that big issues like the European question have been lifted out of democratic contention. So, to some extent, the fact that the Brexit referendum and the Brexit vote happens at all is an expression of problems that are already in place in British politics. But what it does, of course, is rather than resolving those tensions in the way that David Cameron had expected, which would allow him to put that issue back in the box and carry on governing, it detonated them and, in a sense, made them the kind of controlling story of British politics.
My sense is that one of the things that is going on here is a result of the mismatch between the size of Labour's majority and the size of its vote. So I want to come on to questions about the electoral system. But the size of the majority is interesting. It feels a little like it's been a curse for Keir Starmer. My sense of it is that he would be leading a more stable government with a majority of 40, actually, or even 20, partly because of the disciplining effect, partly because of that thing that is often said, which is when you win a big majority, including getting MPs elected who weren't expecting to be elected, you actually get a parliamentary party which is harder to control. Do you think the size of the majority is actually part of the problem here?
I do. If we look back to another Prime Minister who struggles desperately in the way that Keir Starmer has been doing, it's entirely understandable why Theresa May found governing difficult, because she started off with a tiny majority and rapidly lost that. But what we've learnt, both from Keir Starmer and in fact from Boris Johnson, is that governments with very large majorities can also be very fractious. And that's partly as you suggest, because in a sense, large majorities are intrinsically unstable. You're winning in places that you don't normally win. You have large numbers of MPs, therefore, who are especially sensitive to the opinions of constituencies that are not naturally sympathetic to your politics. You have large numbers of MPs who, frankly, don't have very much to do and who feel like they're being neglected and have visions of how politics ought to be. But also, the price of winning a large majority can be a kind of blood sacrifice that then poisons everything that follows. One of the reasons why Labour won that large majority was that it shut down a lot of things it might do in government. It tied itself up in pledges around things like its tax policy and its spending policy and its red lines on Europe. And actually, it would have been a more powerful government if it had had a smaller majority, but had not had those iron constraints around what it could actually do in office.
A few people have compared where we are now with the 1920s. There was a revolving door in the early 1920s. It was an unstable time. The party system seemed to be changing. The difference between then and now, and I don't think this is just with hindsight, it was pretty clear in the 1920s that the shift that was underway in a two-party system was one of the two parties was going to be replaced by another. The Labour Party was coming and the Liberal Party, by the end of the 1920s, it was clear was in decline. This doesn't feel like that, in the sense that I couldn't tell you who or what is going to replace one of the two main parties, which makes me feel like they are not going to be replaced, and yet their vote share is shrinking all the time. So to me, this feels like a different kind of instability than the 1920s.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of talk of the 1920s recently because it's the last time that we've had this kind of extraordinary party instability, and it's the last time at which we've seen a new party replacing one of the existing parties of government. And to some extent, there is a kind of longer pattern in British politics where there's some kind of detonation in the party system, and there's then a roughly 10-year period afterwards in which a new kind of politics struggles to emerge. So that would be 1916 in the First World War, when the Liberal Party splits over the conflict. We could also talk about Catholic emancipation in 1829, which has a similarly fractal effect. I think there are two key differences, though, between where we are now and where we were in the 1920s, which makes this period more sulphurous. One is that although we see a lot of changes of government in the early 1920s, the personnel are actually quite stable. So between 1916 and 1937, a 21-year period, only 4 people are Prime Minister. One of those is Andrew Bonar-Law, who was 7 months before he dies. So essentially, we're talking actually about 3 figures, Lloyd George, Stanley Baldwin, and Ramsay MacDonald, who are alternating in office. So there is a certain stability in terms of a governing class. The second, as you say, is that in the early 1920s, one major party is collapsing, the Liberal Party. Right now, both major parties are collapsing, and there really isn't a precedent for that. You mentioned the 2024 general election. In that election, the Labour Party wins a majority on the smallest share of the vote of any majority party in history, about 34%. In the local elections that we've had this year, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party put together polled about 34% of the vote. So we're in completely uncharted waters here in terms of the simultaneous collapse of the traditional governing elites.
Anthony, what has happened to the authority of the office of Prime Minister? Is Starmer a symptom or a cause of this? Because clearly we've had a revolving door. The authority is somewhat diminished. Is this a historic shift?
Well, I think the interesting thing, David, is that we've priced it in for the Conservatives, 5 prime ministers in 14 years, and a lot of turbulence. The whole of John Major's premiership from almost the moment he won the 1992 general election onwards, certainly after Black Wednesday, was just one endless story of rebellion and revolt and lack of respect for his authority. But we had not done the same for Labour. Labour only had 6 prime ministers in 100 years, and they've served on average 5 years each. They've been giant figures, and so Keir Starmer, why wasn't he going to be the same thing? And to have won the 3rd biggest landslide victory, and then within 2 years to be in the exit lounge, if not yet out the door, it just shows that it's now spilt over to Labour. It's not just a Conservative phenomenon. there's been a significant change in stability in politics, authority as a leader, ability of the leader to command respect. And yet, I still feel it's profoundly their fault for not doing the job.
The authority of the Prime Minister, it depends on various things. It depends on patronage. That's part of it. In modern times, electoral legitimacy is a key element of this. Winning a general election is meant to be the thing that gives the Prime Minister authority and the ability to command the news agenda and the legislative agenda. Where is the weakness coming from here? Patronage presumably still works as it used to. Is even patronage not what it was?
Well, yes and no. People still fight for those positions, but in Labour, they think they're the positions much more than in the Conservatives to the party rather than to the Premier. And I think that what's happened is that they were simply not good enough. If we take as two key premiers who both won landslides, Johnson in 2019, only 80, but significant. Starmer in 2024. Obviously, there were special circumstances around each of those general elections. Nevertheless, I think that had they governed competently, had they put better people into positions, had they been much clearer what the story of the government was. I mean, Boris Johnson had a story. It was something about getting Brexit done in reality, in governmental terms, and levelling up, but he hadn't a clue, hadn't the patience, hadn't the intellect, hadn't the interest to work it out in practice. So he mortgaged it out to one of his special advisors who had a different agenda. That was Dominic Cummings. And Starmer actually never really told a story. I mean, he talked about, didn't he, when he came in, that he was going to have the new era of stability and he was going to be governing for the country, not for party. But he hadn't a clue how to do it. He did not have either the story or the ability to tell the story through language, speech, and neither did his cabinet ministers. Shockingly, there was no proper plan for growth, not just Rachel Reeves, but across the whole government. There was no plan about what they were going to do. It was far too much concern about campaigning, and it's not good enough. I mean, you switch from being a campaigner to being a governor when you become prime minister, and neither Johnson, who was essentially frivolous, nor Starmer, who was essentially inept as a leader, can make that switch.
You said Labour ministers feel they also owe loyalty to the party, and that is one of the destabilising elements in British politics, which does make it different even from the Blair years, even from the Major years, which is the idea that the party membership is this third player. There are MPs, there is the public, but the party membership will decide leadership in the end. That is the ultimate arbiter. And that seems to have been an enormous destabilizer. And if you look at Labour now, if you look at the shenanigans now, part of the complication is precisely because the jockeying is in part jockeying for the favour of the party membership. That was not true even 20 years ago. And in those 20 years, we have seen the office of Prime Minister become a much more short-lived and unstable thing.
Absolutely correct. And the membership of the Conservative Party being so profoundly unrepresentative of Conservative voters, similar position in Labour, is always going to play to people who are wanting power, imagining that they can utilise power more effectively than the incumbent, and will be trying to get power by appealing to the membership and playing to the gallery. And so, ironically, in the pursuit of greater democracy, albeit democracy for activists rather than for voters, it has made the system of government much less efficient. And every democracy has that trade off. And the more democratic any institution becomes, the less easy it is for a leader to make long term strategic decisions which don't pander to short term interests.
The period that was the first half of my life, where we had prime ministers who were in office for a long time, and even though, as you say, Major, it was a circus for some of that period, he was nonetheless prime minister for 7 years. Thatcher for 11, Blair for 10. In the broad historical sweep, should we actually look at that period as the anomaly? In the sense that actually across British political history, relatively short terms for prime ministers, or at least periods of instability, are the norm, and the The run from 79 to 2007 was the exception?
I'm not certain about that. I mean, the counterfactual is going back to 1721, there have been 58 prime ministers in that 305 years. So, an average of 5 years apiece. So, unusual to have those three prime ministers from 1979 to 2007, 28 years, three prime ministers, average 9.5. I mean, that's unusually long with Thatcher, then Major, then Blair. So unusual to that extent, but equally, the present rate of churn is clearly highly unusual also, and is multi-causal. And I'm not even certain that we will know what the proper explanations are. I think we can posit theories as we're doing about why this churn. I mean, a fifth prime minister, if and when Starmer goes within 4 years, I mean, that's never been seen before. It's extraordinarily bad for the quality of government, for Britain's standing internationally, and for confidence and trust in democracy and government. And we are at the moment going through absolutely a unique period of instability in the modern era with little prospect of an immediate path out of it. The grown ups on both sides, on Labour, Alan Milburn would be transparently better than anyone else around at the moment. Jeremy Hunt for the Conservatives, that kind of figure who doesn't have the immediate charismatic charm, the ability to appeal to members as well as to voters, doesn't seem to be getting the same opportunity. I mean, John Major would not be elected now. Tony Blair would, but Margaret Thatcher might well not. Probably, almost certainly not.
We had in Johnson the charismatic version of the incompetent, and in Starmer we've had the uncharismatic version of the incompetent. So what kind of prime minister could restore the authority of the office? Because frankly, Jeremy Hunt and Alan Milburn also, as he suggests, they aren't going to cut it with the constituencies that matter. They may appeal to the grown-ups, the historians, the intellectuals, the people who want government to make better sense in their terms. But having cycled through, as it were, the charismatic testing of this to destruction and the uncharismatic testing of this to destruction, I struggle to see what the model of the prime minister is who is going to restore the authority of the office.
Well, looking within Britain, it's difficult, but looking abroad, which is always perhaps an easy and a shallow temptation when times are not good. But nevertheless, if one looks to Australia with Anthony Albanese, or if one looks to Canada with Mark Carney, then there are two progressive, left of centre leaders of substance, figures of real authority. So I think that kind of figure who has done a lot, achieved a lot, and who is going to have a stability and a maturity that Truss never had, that Johnson never had, that Starmer never had, that Sunak, I think, would have developed, which we saw at times with Sunak, but he was very young and very inexperienced when he took over. So I think looking to Albanese, looking to Carney, and seeing somebody who has done a lot in life, achieved a lot, which is why I do talk about going back a generation and finding figures who have been proven, who have the know-how about how to govern, the emotional, intellectual, psychological security to be able to do the job. It's hard to see that in any of the candidates for the party at the moment. Burnham a bit, and Miliband.
One of the features of contemporary politics is the assumption is you only get one shot at it. So people are astonished by the thought that Ed Miliband might come back because it's assumed he tried, he failed, and it's the thing that's thrown at him. You had a go, you didn't succeed. For most of British political history, you had more than one shot at it. Prime ministers would come, they would go, and they would come back. This is a feature of politics which has vanished in our time, but was the norm for most of political history. Leadership of party would be long, though prime ministerships might be relatively short. Is that one of the things that we're missing? As it were Ed Miliband, we have no idea what's going to happen, but were Ed Miliband to come back, would that be a signal of a return to a form of politics in which actually experience of defeat can be an asset in a future attempt at the job?
So if we look at our most successful leaders, they've all experienced reversal, and they've dived deep into themselves and found inner strengths. Over half of British prime ministers had very difficult childhoods, often lost a parent. So I think reversal is an essential prerequisite for top job leadership. And yeah, I mean, since the war, Churchill in 1951, Harold Wilson in 1974, with the exceptions that prove the rule that now people don't come back. But that's why Cameron's return as foreign secretary was so interesting in the autumn of 2023, because he was, by all accounts, almost all accounts, an exceptional foreign secretary abroad, including in Washington. And cabinet ministers commented about how he raised the tone and showed them a different level of how to be a cabinet minister. So I think it would be a good thing if there was to be a greater awareness and tolerance of experience and wisdom, even if those people didn't have the charismatic flair of a Johnson or a Farage.
David, start with what is perhaps the basic question. Why has Keir Starmer found it so hard to govern, given the size of the majority that he won in 2024? It still seems to me like a bit of a mystery.
I think the reason is that he doesn't have a project. And I think that when you don't have a project, it's very difficult, firstly, to govern effectively and to set a direction for your government and to ensure that, ministers are working in the same direction. And secondly, it's very difficult for the electorate to have anything they can buy into. If all you have is the abstract idea of change and delivery and improvement, then it's very difficult for voters to kind of come on the journey with you of delivering that, and difficult for them to know what they're looking forward to in the future or know what they need to believe in or have confidence in. I think Keir Starmer's problem is that he isn't really a politician. He's someone who had a very successful career in public life outside of politics. He came into politics, but as leader of the Labour Party, he almost sanded down the sense of what Labour was about to make it more palatable in the 2024 election. And that was a good strategy for opposition. But on coming into government, I don't think that was an effective way of doing things. And I think that has left Labour adrift as a party of government. And it has also left it without a very clear appeal to the public.
What would count as a project in this context, do you think? Do you think Starmerism would be capable of generating a project? Does it, for instance, and you and I have talked about this before, does it need something that could pass as an ideological basis? I've never been clear when people say he needs a project, what a project coming from this politician would look like.
Well, I think you're right to say it's a difficulty of him. And I think that's almost the problem. Is I think what we're finding is that Starmer is not someone who is particularly well cut out to be prime minister, certainly not in this moment. What would a project look like coming from him? I don't know, but I think we can point to politicians around him who do have projects. And I think that there are versions of a Labour project, of a social democratic project that you could envisage today that would have that sense of direction and purpose. I think Ed Miliband has a very clear project. I think Angela Rayner has a project. I think arguably Wes Streeting on the right of the party has a project. I think there are projects there, but I think Keir Starmer is not a very ideological person. And I think that to be an effective prime minister, you do have to have some kind of ideology. You have to have some sense of what you're doing it for. What is the country that you're trying to create? And if you don't have that vision, then there's nothing for your government to work towards. And there's nothing for the electorate to decide whether they believe it or not.
Wes Streeting might have a project on the right. Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband, we may discover quite soon, Andy Burnham might have a project on the left. Is that divide within Labour politics the traditional divide? Is the party factional in ways that would be familiar to Harold Wilson, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, I don't know, maybe even Clement Attlee? Is this a familiar story of Labour politics, that in government, one of the biggest challenges for the Prime Minister is to marshal a party that has these divisions in it? And if that is true, and the various divisions on offer on one or other side, is that not going to repeat?
I think that the basic kind of factional structure, whether there's a left and a right, and these groups, people know where you sit within these factions, is fairly traditional and fairly coherent with Labour history. And the problem of managing these factions has always been a problem that Labour prime ministers have had to deal with. I would be very sceptical of saying that I think that the existence of those factional divides is the problem, because I think a more effective prime minister could manage them. I don't think they make the party ungovernable. I do think, though, that we are seeing the basic traditional factional divisions in some ways struggling to adapt to the new ideological and practical divisions within the party. I think there are huge debates within the party over who Labour's electorate is, who Labour's electorate should be, and those kind of transcend the left-right divide. So there's this question of, should Labour be trying to win back, quote unquote, the working classes who have been lost to first Boris Johnson's Conservatives and then to Reform, or should Labour accept being a party of liberal middle-class graduates? That would be the very kind of stereotyped way of framing this divide. And that's something that I think actually cuts across the left-right divide within the party. You'll find people on the right of the party who are obsessed with winning back the red wall, Labour's, as they see it, traditional electorate. And you'll also find people on the right of the party who are very comfortable with becoming more of a liberal, middle-class, progressive party. And the same on the soft left of the party. You'll find people who say, we need to be more progressive, we need to speak to our progressive voters, even if they are graduates rather than Labour's traditional working class electorate. And on the other hand, you'll find people on the left of the party who say, no, it is all about winning back the working class through left-wing economics. So I think we have these new kind of cross-cutting divisions that aren't necessarily expressed factionally.
It's part of the underlying problem here that Labour, as it understands its own history, I think on the whole believes that it succeeds when it is a big tent party. It needs to be able to accommodate both within its own MPs, but also within the electorate, a range of these views. And big tent politics is the thing that's hardest in contemporary Britain. In a way, that's the thing that is the biggest struggle. I don't know if Starmer thought of himself as a big tent politician, because like you say, he also sanded it down, which is a bit odd, in the sense to be both a minimalist and a big tent politician is, I think, a contradiction in terms. But that idea, certainly the idea that Blair had, that for Labour to really succeed, it's got to be capable of accommodating these rival conceptions of what the country is and what politics should be. Is that the real challenge for the party now? In a way, that kind of politics is the thing that has become much harder than it was even 20 years ago.
I think this absolutely is one of the major challenges that Labour faces, which is that Labour is a party that aims to win a large portion of the country. It's not a niche party, and it consciously is always trying to win quite a large portion of the country in a politics that is ever more fragmented. Now, there's a big history to this, which is that Labour was initially the working class party, but it was very confident in the early 20th century that the working class either was or would soon be the majority of the British public. So the question wasn't really there, because Labour would be the working class party, the working class were the majority, and Labour could confidently win. And then from the kind of late 70s, 80s, I mean, even earlier than that, in the eyes of some people, there was this sense that actually that wasn't enough, and that there needed to be a coalition between the working class and the progressive sections of the middle class. And this is what David Marquand called the progressive dilemma. How do you bring together these different sections of the public? And I think what we have today is something much more difficult, which is it's no longer a question of taking the working class and adding on a bit of the progressive middle class. We have a much more fragmented sociological environment. And it's a question of how do you bring together a coalition of people behind a single project when people are more fragmented, when people's loyalties to any institution or political project are much less, and also when I think people think of politics in a much more expressive way. I think that today, a lot of people, when they go and vote, and we have polling evidence to support this, they care about voting for someone who expresses their values. And I think that's very different to how people voted in the past, when a lot of voting was habitual. You knew which side you voted for, and you basically had faith in an institution. If you were a traditional Labour voter, you voted Labour. You weren't paying attention to if Harold Wilson is expressing your values. You just know that this is the side you're on. And I think today people see politics in this expressive sense, and so it really matters to them that a party leader seems to talk in the way that resonates with them. And I think part of Labour's problem is that Labour has in its own view, been delivering for progressive voters on workers' rights, on climate, on housing, on transport. It's done a lot of really quite left-wing things, if you look at what it's done with trade unions, what it's renationalised the railways. But it hasn't been talking in a language that expresses the sentiments of progressive voters. So if we're looking at why Labour is losing to the Greens, it's because it's struggling to adapt to the new way in which people engage with politics. And if you do have a fragmented political and sociological landscape, and you do have expressive voting, that challenge of being the big tent party becomes really, really difficult because you somehow have to express the values of many different groups at once.
Do you think Starmer, the people around Starmer, should have foreseen that purging the party of the Corbynites, which I think for them was a big part of the project, they wanted a party that included Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting, in that sense a big tent party, but that part of the party that they thought was toxic would be pushed out. And if you showed them politics now and showed them where Corbyn is, they would have said, this is perfect, this is exactly what we want. Your party would be their ideal, right on the fringes, capturing almost no media attention. And yet they seem to completely miss that in the expressive political landscape, the purge of Corbynism might empower a Green Party that Jeremy Corbyn is not part of, but that version of politics can be given voice to by a politician and indeed by a movement, stripped of its associations with the things that Starmer thought he was purging the Labour Party of. I don't know whether I think they should have foreseen that or not, but part of me thinks that they probably should.
Yes, I think that the Starmer project was, I think at most stages, really quite a short-sighted project focused on overcoming specific hurdles and addressing specific problems right in front of them. I think you can see it in policy terms. The tax pledges were a great short-term move to win the election and a terrible move in terms of governing just a couple of years later. In terms of how they approach the base, I do think there is a kind of misunderstanding of modern politics that went on, which is that if you have this sort of 1990s view of politics, the role of the party member and of the enthusiastic supporter isn't very important. You need some of them to deliver your leaflets, to do some get out the vote, but the sort of public messaging is all done from the top through newspapers and television. But in the world we live in today, your enthusiastic supporters, your fans, I think fan is the best way of understanding it, are your message carriers across social media. If you want people to be getting your message, you need people out there in the country who are enthusiastic about you and are going to be selling your message. And they're not going to be selling it in a kind of marketing sense, but they're the people who are going to be going, you know what, I think this guy's really got a point in the family WhatsApp group, in the local Facebook group. And I think that Labour post-Corbyn really failed to understand the value of that and the power of that, and now finds itself without those kinds of defenders. I mean, I used to live on the Kent coast, and I was in the local Facebook group there. And in the local Facebook group, sometimes people would post about politics, and you'd get these sort of people posting, and they'd be totally random people posting enthusiasm for reform, posting kind of AI-generated images of Nigel Farage hugging the Easter Bunny, saying, he stands up for British culture. And you'd get people posting kind of left-wing things about how we should be supporting refugees. And then every now and then, a Labour councillor would post something in the Facebook group about something that they had done in the local area. And nobody would engage with it. Nobody would like it. Some people would angrily react to it or comment very angrily underneath. And there were clearly these left-wing people in the Facebook group who were fighting with the reform supporters in the comments. But there was no one there actually saying, you know what, I think the Labour Council's doing a really good job. And I think that is because Labour didn't see that it needed to have a base of support that would actually stick up for it in these kinds of environments. It was too focused on the ways in which supporters could be off-putting, and certainly parties more extreme and enthusiastic supporters can often be off-putting to more moderate voters. But I think it lost sight of the ways in which these people are really necessary in a modern media environment.
Hannah, do you think the struggles of the Starmer administration are pretty much of a piece with the struggles of the administrations that preceded it, that this period that we've been through, say, since Brexit, historians will look back and see the Starmer years as part of a pattern? Or do you think it's its own thing? Actually, there's something distinctive about the failures of Starmer and Starmerism.
I think the context in which Starmer's trying to govern is, of course, similar. It's continuity from some of the big shocks we've had to deal with as a country, some of which have been sort of unique to us, like the decision to leave the EU, some of which have been global shocks, which all countries have had to face, like the economic impact of various wars, geopolitical change, pandemic, etc. Some of those universal crises have had specifically UK features. So those have presented challenges over the last decade, and those challenges, some of them were short-term and had to be dealt with at the time, like the response to the pandemic, but lots of them had long tails, which have continued through to have to be addressed by the Starmer government. And I think the way in which our politics has changed in response to some of those crises has common features which affected the Conservative governments, which we saw before, and are now affecting Labour. But I also think there are some things which are specific to the way in which Starmer and Labour have approached government, which have created new issues for them.
I'm going to borrow 2 words from the Tony Blair lexicon. Do you think those specific issues relate primarily to a lack of grip or a lack of vision? Because you hear different accounts from different people as to what the real problem is. Is it grip or vision that's missing? Or both? But if it is both, which matters more?
I think it's a combination of both, but I think what unfortunately appears to be similar between Starmer and some of his predecessors as Prime Minister is a primary focus on getting to power and being in charge, rather than a clear vision of what you want to do with the power once you get there. Understandable for Labour, having sort of suddenly realised it could win a couple of years out from the 24 election, to be very focused on winning first, because of course if you don't win you can't do anything with that power. But I think there really wasn't enough attention paid to the programme that they wanted to deliver, how they wanted to change the country once they came to power. In terms of grip, I do think there have been problems there too. There are issues with our government system which make it difficult to govern. We have a very centralised country, but quite a weak centre. And unless you have a Prime Minister who is very clear on their key priorities and also takes a sort of leadership approach to the role rather than a more managerial approach, which I think we've seen from Starmer, it's really hard to get the whole government system marshalled behind delivery. And then, of course, as we've already discussed, the circumstances are difficult. There isn't a lot of money to throw at solving problems, public service reform, that sort of thing. So you've got to be quite clever about how you affect change within the system when you don't have a lot of money to do it.
One of the puzzles here is that this is a Prime Minister with a large parliamentary majority, historically about as large as they come. And the parliamentary majority seems to have been more of a burden than a gift to him. People often talk, you and I have discussed this, about what it would take for Parliament to re-establish its authority. And in some ways, in the past couple of years, we have seen backbench MPs exert a kind of authority which is unusual in recent British political history. And yet there's a slight be careful what you wish for feeling about it, in the sense that we've seen what it looks like for Parliament to be more assertive, and it hasn't gone well. Again, do you think this is a distinctive feature of the dynamics of this administration and the relationship between this Prime Minister and his backbench MPs, and possibly even a different political outlook between them, or this is more structural than that?
I think there are some similarities if you look at Starmer and Rishi Sunak as his predecessor, in terms of not being able to get your parliamentary party to back you on the big things that you want to do. And maybe for Sunak that was to do with coming in at the tail end without a long time to be able to sort of establish himself as a leader and so on. But I think that the nature of the way that MPs operate in Parliament has changed. As you say, having a large majority doesn't mean that you can necessarily get your programme through as a leader. And I don't think Prime Ministers have sufficiently adapted to that reality. As you say, backbenchers have realised that, if they get together, they can exert their power within the parliamentary system. This goes back to the European Research Group, I think, during Brexit. If you get together, you can challenge the executive on certain parts of the programme. And if you are a Prime Minister who hasn't built a vision of a complete sense of where you want to take the country, and a sense that all the parts of your programme are integral to that vision, then it is, I think, we're seeing quite easy for different groups of backbenchers to unpick different parts of that programme. And I think in circumstances like we are now, where Labour backbenchers, lots of them think they probably won't win their seats at the next election, they have limited other incentives to back the Prime Minister. That it's better for them on a personal level to establish their credentials for having stood up for certain elements of policy that they really believe in, and they don't think they're going to get to be ministers, and they don't think they're going to be in Parliament for much longer. And I think that has really changed that sense that actually the collective is more important. In the past, I mean, I'm interested in what you think about this, but in the past, leaders were seen to have been better at persuading the parliamentary party that the interests of the whole were more important than the interest of the individual.
The thing that I've been astonished by, and this is a theme that people have commented on a lot, but I was really struck by it yesterday. So I should say, we're speaking the day after it was discovered that Andy Burnham will be fighting the seat of Makerfield and that Josh Simons, the MP there, has stood down. And listening to the coverage, not simply how much of the communication between journalists and MPs was taking place on WhatsApp, but how the MPs talked about their WhatsApp group as their primary focus of loyalty. I mean, genuinely, people in this particular context, it's a particularly dynamic context for that kind of politics, but speaking about the collegiality of the group, what the group could and couldn't bear, would the group move together or not? And though I was aware, and I've heard anecdotally, the extent to which MPs spend their time on WhatsApp, yesterday was the first time I was struck by the thought that the WhatsApp group is actually one of the things that is structuring loyalty in politics now. And that must be new. Of course, in the past, there were clubs, Tory dining clubs. During the Thatcher years, one was always reading about these various groups of MPs who would meet and give themselves a name. But given WhatsApp groups are so easily set up, but also themselves so dynamic, that feels to me like a really significant shift.
I think that's true. And I don't know whether this is just the sort of technologically enabled version of British politics moving towards a more fragmented sort of continental European style system where you do have smaller parties with more specific interest groups. And because our large structural party systems have not adapted rapidly enough to the reality of how politics has shifted, technology has kind of stepped into that breach.
Do you think the relationship between the Starmer administration and the civil service, particularly in the aftermath of his sacking of Sir Ollie Robbins and the fallout of the Mandelson affair, I think we can call it an affair rather than a scandal now, is that worse than existed under his predecessors? Again, one reads things that suggest it is pretty bad now, and the mistrust between government and civil service, Westminster and Whitehall, is as bad as it's ever been. Is that right? And is that indeed part of the problem that he had in governing?
I think there's been a journey that has happened here. So I think at the start of the administration, there was real hope within the civil service that Labour were going to be less negative towards them. There was a sense there was a government coming in with a new agenda, and there was a lot of positivity towards Labour from that point of view. And I think that across the civil service, and obviously there's lots of variation depending on where you look, there have been very good relationships between ministers and their departments. But I also think over time there's been growing frustration from the political side with the stickiness of the machine, the sludge, as they like to talk about it. And that has been expressed obviously by Keir Starmer, and he's talking about the tepid bath and so on. And then civil servants, senior civil servants, have started to get caught up in some of this, in some of the tendency for Starmer when something goes wrong for there to be a scapegoat. And some of those scapegoats have most recently been civil servants. And this is not in particular a comment on those cases, in that, I think there's certainly, you can understand why Starmer chose to exchange Chris Wormold for Antonio Romeo. That clearly wasn't working, and it was probably a poor appointment choice by him in the first place. Chris Wormold having many virtues, but not being the sort of reforming person who Starmer now has with Antonio Romeo. So I think that there's been a journey, but I do think now, and particularly with what's happening with the leadership of the Labour Party and the debate over that, that is going to cause a real slump in the ability of the political class to drive the government machine to deliver, because there's just so much uncertainty. Are there going to be more ministerial resignations? Who is going to be actually running my department in 5 minutes' time? Is this actually going to be a priority? Are we going to have whole new leadership at the top? That sort of uncertainty is never good for getting the civil service to be productive. So while I think Antonio Romeo has come in and made a really good start and really showing some leadership from the top and articulating the need for reform and so on, the political side of this now is just counting against that, making that a much harder task.
And there's almost a feeling that these things are out of sync, because I've also heard that Antonio Romeo's appointment has galvanised aspects of government. But as you say, Chris Wilmot was Starmer's choice. So he wasted a year or whatever it was in those terms. And he's now brought in someone to galvanise his government just at the point when his government is falling apart. And so it does feel like, particularly in an age where turnover is quicker on both sides of this, so we need to recognise in all aspects of life, actually turnover is probably quicker than it used to be. In a way, the real problem is these turnovers are out of sync. I can understand, if you're Starmer, the frustration of thinking, I've finally got someone who could drive an agenda here, but oops, I've just blown up my prime ministership. The timing is wrong.
I mean, I think in an ideal world, the leadership of the civil service should be on a longer time, that turnover should be longer. It's undesirable that we've had quite as much turnover of cabinet secretaries as we have. And I would hope that certainly if we have a change of prime minister soon, and even, that Antonio Romeo would stay in role beyond the next election, and that shouldn't be seen as that an incoming government now would necessarily change CabSec. So I think that in some ways, it's still a really good thing if she starts to galvanise the machine, because we have a big problem across the political system of distrust and concern about the capability of the civil service to deliver. And yes, it's unfortunate that the government's agenda, I think, will sort of lose momentum because of what's going on with the Labour Party. But the hard work of reform of the civil service is actually a lot down to the civil service itself, and shouldn't be reliant on having to have, yes, political sponsorship is important too, but they should be getting on with it anyway, because it needs to be done. And it doesn't only need to be done because the current government has decided it's a priority. We all know it's a priority.
Rob, how much of the government's difficulty do you think stems from the mismatch, which goes back to the general election, between the size of its majority and the fragmentation of the political landscape? Clearly, the fragmentation has continued since 2024, but do you think there's an original issue here? A party in Westminster with that size of majority in a country that just doesn't reflect that kind of politics?
Yes, I think there is, David. At the time of the election itself, I called Labour's Westminster majority an electoral Jenga tower, because it was very small, but it was built on weakened foundations, much like when we build big Jenga towers, you pull blocks out from the bottom, plonk them on the top. If you look at the result, it's 34% of the vote, delivering 2/3 of the seats, the biggest disproportionality in any Westminster election ever, one of the biggest disproportionalities in any first-past-the-post election anywhere ever. Layer on top of that the fact that the turnout was 59%, the second lowest turnout under the universal franchise. Do the sums on that, it means only 1 in 5 of those eligible to vote in that election actually endorsed the landslide majority-winning Starmer government. And that is a new scenario in our politics. Never before has a government been so dominant in the House of Commons based on such a weak endorsement from the electorate. So I think much of what we have seen since, in terms of the travails of this government, its rapid collapse in the polls, can be traced to that foundational factor. It was clearly one factor, at least, in why they have struggled so much, which is far fewer voters were invested in this government from day one than has been true of earlier governments that have won dominant majorities.
How much do you think this government, the Starmer government, has been aware of that? Because I've been struck, not just in this week of chaos, but going a long way back, the extent to which Starmer built his pitch on his mandate. And the mandate was the election victory and the thumping majority, almost in place of having a story or a narrative about what he wanted to do in government. He has been, it seems to me, unusually insistent for a politician that his right to be listened to govern, to have dissenting voices in his party shut up, goes back to that election. And I've been struck all the way along that it's a very weak argument. He apparently sat the cabinet down and said, "You owe your places here to me," as though he'd somehow constructed something which was remarkable, not for the thinness of it, but for the way in which he himself heroically led his troops over the top. The opposition party collapsed. Nobody voted for him, and he got a majority by default. It's not a mandate.
I think there's a lot to that analysis, David. And I think to understand the pathologies of Starmer in government, it's important to remember the trajectory of Starmer in opposition. If we go back, for example, to 2019, then of course the scenario was essentially the non-radical left factions within Labour, not just the traditional Labour right, but basically all the non-Corbynite factions, more or less uniting behind Starmer as the only candidate who could wrestle control of the party back from the Corbyn faction that looked so dominant amongst the membership. And one thing to remember when Starmer keeps talking about mandates is that although it's faded in the memory of the average voter, it is not faded in the memory of the average Labour activist or MP, that Starmer won a huge majority of the membership in that membership election against the Corbynites' favoured successor. It was as big a win as Blair got in 94 or as Corbyn himself got in 2015. So I think sometimes when he is read as talking about 2024, he may also be talking about 2020, and it may well have set his course in terms of this uncompromising approach. Because number one, they won the mandate for change within the Labour Party. And number two, the people who then assembled themselves around Starmer were people who were absolutely determined to expunge the influence of the left within the Labour Party. There's an old joke that does the round in social media that, everyone within Labour likes to sort of settle elections or public opinion or policy conflicts so they can get back to the main fight, which is the fight against their enemies within the Labour Party, because that's what they really care about. And a lot of the people around, although Starmer is often said to not be particularly factional, I wonder about that after the last couple of years, but that is what was always said. The people he assembled around him very much were. And so for them, this was an opportunity to put the left back within some sort of a sealed tomb. That is what they pursued. And I think this is why they interpreted the election mandate so aggressively, because it also should be remembered that their strategy was a deliberate gamble. All the way through their period in opposition, they said, we start with 200 seats. We have to win 150 seats plus in order to govern with a majority. We have to gamble everything on marginal seats and marginal voters. We have to, as it were, ignore safe Labour seats in order to win the seats that are necessary to get a governing majority. So their spin on the result would be, this is the price of victory in our system. We had to throw everything at the marginals. We had to pitch ourselves where we feel the marginal voter is. And if that means people on the left and the progressive side in the safe seats aren't very impressed with us, well, that is a price we had to pay. Now, I personally feel from the perspective of 2026 that argument doesn't look as strong as it did in 2024. What the 2024 result clearly was a shot across the bows electorally. Voters were, or perhaps a shrug across the bows. Voters were saying, we will accept this change of government, but we accept it with some pretty heavy caveats attached. We are not wholly enthused about this. We are not wholly united behind this. And so I absolutely do think that the way the government has and Starmer's people have taken it as a wholesale endorsement of their entire approach, it should really not have been treated like that. It should have been treated as a moment to pause and reflect and perhaps adjust course.
Do you think they believed that the progressive left and voters in safe seats in the end would have nowhere else to go, that the logic of first past the post politics would reassert itself, people might be disgruntled, but they would come back, and that they've been genuinely taken by surprise by the Green threat, what's happened to the vote on the left, the way in which it's fragmented? Do you think this was something they didn't foresee? I don't know if they should have foreseen it, But I'm curious as to whether they even considered it a possibility, because one of the things that's so interesting here is Corbyn's exactly where they want him. If they could have been shown your party, they would have said, well, that was a triumph. The trouble is, that's not where Corbynism is.
Yes, exactly right, David. I don't think they anticipated the magnitude of the threat they faced from the Greens, not in terms of winning seats. They thought the Greens would become a sort of oppositional party for them in places where they could afford to lose 20 or 30% of the vote. I don't think anyone within Starmer's Labour Party, or perhaps the Labour Party in general, would have anticipated that they would fall from 40% in the polls when the election was called to 34% when the votes were cast, and then down to 17% less than 2 years later. That trajectory is extraordinary. All of that said, though, it is a stumbling block that both of the traditional parties of government have repeatedly tripped up over in the past 15 or 20 years or so. This phenomenon of fragmentation and this unwillingness of voters to just be put on the sidelines is a repeating theme in our politics now. Labour took Scotland for granted because the Scots had nowhere else to go until they did. Labour took Wales for granted because the Welsh had nowhere else to go until they did. The Tories took South England for granted because the Conservative vote there had nowhere else to go in the post-Brexit years until suddenly the Tory Remainers discovered Ed Davey. And now Labour is saying to the voters in the big cities from 2024 onwards, you've got nowhere else to go, we don't need to listen to you, except suddenly they do. It seems voters are becoming both less patient and more strategic. Although first the past the post is supposed to squeeze out this kind of behaviour, it works very well until it suddenly stops working and becomes your worst enemy. And that's what keeps happening to the big parties. So all of that as well said, now speaking in a typical academic fashion, arguing against myself, for myself, against myself again, I do sympathise with their dilemma. The purpose of the big parties of government, Labour and Tory, is to assemble big tent coalitions. In a diverse country of 70 million plus people, big tent coalitions, by their very nature, are going to have to emphasise some people more than others, are going to have to take some groups and factions for granted, because that's the nature of building that kind of coalition. The problem is that for the big parties, the game of whack-a-mole on that front just keeps getting harder and harder and harder. Every time they try and pitch themselves to one particular part of the centre ground, a new threat emerges somewhere else. And maybe that suggests that this model of politics, is just not fit for purpose anymore in the 21st century, and we'll need to move to something a bit more European. Maybe voters just aren't willing to accept half-a-loaf style big tent parties anymore.
Do you think holding on to or even reconstructing the big tent is currently harder on the left or on the right? So we still have these blocks in politics which are relatively stable and relatively evenly divided, but it's asymmetric in the sense that on the left, it's not just three, because if you include Wales and Scotland, it's five parties. On the right, it is essentially two. And yet on the right, it looks quite fixed, in the sense that it might have seemed even a year ago that Reform might have had a chance of knocking the Conservatives out of the game. If the Conservative Party had fallen apart, there wasn't really anywhere else for voters on the right to go. Some would never vote Reform, but quite a lot might have ended up by default to keep Zach Polanski or whoever out. But actually on the right, it now looks like both the ceiling and the floor for the two parties competing is both quite rigid and quite narrow, whereas it looks a little more fluid on the left, but there are more parties. So I can't really decide which. I mean, both is a nightmare in a way, but which is harder if you wanted to reconstruct a big tent?
If we're talking about a big tent at the level of the national map, I think it is easier for the right, looking at where we are right now. Reform have kind of achieved that. We've seen that in the local elections last year. We've seen it in the local elections this year. They have a 25 to 30% coalition. Now, they need to be at 30%, not 25%, because first past the post starts hurting them very, very hard when they sort of fall into the mid-20s. But if they can sit at 30% as the dominant party on the right, with the Conservatives on about 10 to 15%, that is potentially a Commons majority winning coalition if the left remains fragmented. But the reason I had the caveat, if we're talking about a national map, is The other complication in all of this is voters can read polls, voters can also read maps, as we discovered in 2024 with all these MRP pollings and the people picking up on the local constituency context. We've seen it in by-elections in the last couple of years too. The route for the left to a majority coalition may be more like a patchwork quilt route, that essentially voters converge on different not reform options in different parts of the country. SNP, Plaid out of England, then the Lib Dems in the south of England, the Greens in the big cities, and potentially Labour still in a lot of the traditional marginals. One of the interesting sub-stories of last week's local elections, I mean, there were so many different subplots in those local elections, very hard to keep track as like a Netflix series, really, all in one. But one that I feel didn't get the attention that perhaps it should, but is worth pondering, is that in the bits of London where Labour and the Conservatives have traditionally been very dominant, very traditional two-party politics, and these places aren't leavy enough for reform to really stick their oars in, it's still Labour and Conservative after these elections, even in these fragmented times. And I suspect part of the reason is voters recognising that, it's best to stick with Labour on the left in this area, because otherwise you're just going to get a Conservative councillor or potentially even a Reform councillor. So on the right, a route to, Reform 300 seats, Tories 60 seats, right majority is kind of clear from the map and from the polling and from how election results have gone in the last couple of years. On the left, it's more uncertain, it's more chaotic. But if voters can coordinate on a not reform alternative in their seats, and it's a different not reform alternatives in lots of different places, but that can then result in a kind of rainbow coalition majority. You might have Labour 200 seats, Greens 100 seats, Lib Dems 70 seats, something like that. So both sides have a route to a majority, but it does very much depend on geography, tactical voting coordination. And the bigger point, stepping back from all of this, is the direct linkage between the will that's being expressed by the voters and the results we're getting in the Commons is getting diluted more and more and more. Voters are having to play all of these kind of tactical and strategic games. They're having to think about second and third best options. And again, that points to the fact that first past the post is an electoral system that is really only optimal in a sort of very narrow set of conditions. If you've got 5 parties, 6 parties competing everywhere, it's an extremely unpredictable and suboptimal system that requires voters to engage in a lot of game playing, and therefore, the read across from what the voters are saying on the ballot papers to what they actually want, it's no longer there. So at the heart of all of this, aside from the question of which parties can build majorities under these constraints, is do these constraints make any sense in our current context, and maybe they need to change?
Do you think, beyond the possibility of a rainbow coalition, that on the left, say an Andy Burnham prime ministership, gives Labour a shot at reassembling the coalition under its own banner? Or do you think, essentially, that ship has sailed?
It's a great question, because I feel like whatever answer I give, there's a chance that events make a fool of me, because I think it's very uncertain. It's very uncertain. I think the premise of the Burnham candidacy is precisely that I can fix what has been broken. I've shown it in Greater Manchester. I am the person who can assemble this kind of big tent coalition. I mean, Burnham's results in Greater Manchester are really very remarkable. 2/3 of the vote across a very diverse set of 10 boroughs that takes in very Labour reform type territory, very Leave type territory, and then very ethnically diverse, socially liberal city centre type territory too. And he plays well in all of those places. But we have to remember how Burnham has gone about doing this. What sort of political story has he been telling people up here and telling the nation as well? It's an oppositional political story. It's a populist in some ways political story. The point where he really shot up in terms of his popularity was the COVID arguments, when he attacked the Johnson government for turning the North into a laboratory and treating the North like second-class citizens and all this kind of thing. The clips of him frowning at mobile phones with messages from the government going viral and so on. And that was quintessential us against them politics. I'm standing up for Greater Manchester against those out of touch, distant Westminster politicians. And, we've seen that story a number of times now. We've seen it with the SNP in Scotland. We're seeing it with Plaid. Obviously, it's at the heart of Reform's appeal as well, and the Greens too. So he's riding the wave that we're seeing everywhere. But can you really govern like that from Westminster when you are the thing that is distant and disliked and distrusted? That is a very, very different kind of challenge. And honestly, I don't know what the answer is. I think his approach to politics from the perspective of imagery and symbols and storytelling and linking policy to broader narratives and values, I think he'll be much better at that. He's got very good at that in his current role. But then, Boris Johnson was good at those kinds of aspects of politics too, having done a similar kind of job in a similar kind of way. And he came to grief pretty quickly in Downing Street. The ultimate answer is, I honestly think this is true of any person going into Downing Street, is you just don't know how they're going to fare because the job is so different to anything that they've done before. I think we can predict what things will be different about Burnham versus Starmer in terms of his approach to the job. Whether it will work and how it will work in terms of policy and ministers, that's just a big unknown, really.
That was part one. Part two will be in our regular slot, and it will be a little more forward-looking, although the line between past, present and future in this situation, as you'll have just heard, is not entirely clear. And it's also possible something might change between now and Wednesday. And if it does, God help us, we'll try and keep up. So, part two, next time in our regular slot. Do please join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.